After the conquest of Jerusalem, the fate of its people was sealed not on the battlefield but in the cold, calculating machinery of Roman commerce. Thousands upon thousands of prisoners were transported away from the smoldering ruins of their beloved city, torn from the land of their ancestors and cast into an uncertain future that stretched before them like an endless, dark road. The city that had once echoed with prayers, songs, and the voices of families now stood silent and empty, while its surviving population was scattered across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire like seeds thrown into a merciless wind. Some captives were marched across long distances in chains, their wrists and ankles bound by heavy iron shackles that cut into their flesh with every step. These long columns of prisoners moved slowly across the dusty roads of Judea, through the rocky hills of the Galilee, along the coastal plains, and eventually toward major Roman cities where their fates would be decided. The marches lasted days, sometimes weeks, under the unforgiving sun. Guards showed little patience for those who faltered. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion, dehydration, or illness were often left where they fell, abandoned on the roadside to die alone. The stronger captives were forced to keep moving, driven forward by the crack of whips and the sharp commands of their Roman escorts. Every step took them farther from their homeland, farther from everything they had ever known, and closer to a life of servitude from which most would never return. Others were placed on ships heading toward Roman ports and markets where slaves were bought and sold in enormous quantities. The Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea, became a highway for human cargo. Captives were packed into the dark, suffocating holds of merchant vessels, crammed together with barely enough room to sit or lie down. The voyages were treacherous and miserable. Many prisoners fell ill during the journey, weakened by seasickness, dehydration, and the unbearable conditions below deck. Some did not survive the crossing at all. Those who did arrive at their destinations emerged from the ships broken, disoriented, and terrified, only to face the horror of what awaited them on the docks, the slave markets. Slave markets were common across the Roman Empire and existed in nearly every major city, from Rome itself to Alexandria in Egypt, from Antioch in Syria to Corinth in Greece. These markets were bustling centers of commerce where human beings were treated as merchandise, no different from livestock, grain, or cloth. The markets were typically set up in public squares or near major forums, where large crowds of buyers, merchants, and curious onlookers gathered to inspect the latest arrivals. In these markets, captives were stripped of their remaining dignity. They were inspected, examined, priced, and sold like property. Buyers would walk among the rows of captives, studying their physical condition, checking their teeth, examining their hands for signs of strength or skill, and asking questions about their age, health, and abilities. Captives were often forced to stand on raised wooden platforms or stone blocks so that potential buyers could see them clearly from all sides. Signs or placards were sometimes hung around their necks, listing their origin, age, and any particular skills they possessed. The entire process was designed to maximize profit and efficiency, reducing human beings to commodities with a price tag. Young and healthy prisoners often fetched the highest prices at these markets. Strong men were valued for heavy labor, work in quarries, mines, construction projects, and agricultural estates. Young women were sought after for a variety of purposes, including domestic service, textile work, and other roles within wealthy Roman households. Children, too, were sold, sometimes separated from their mothers in transactions that caused indescribable anguish. Buyers included wealthy patrician families seeking household servants, merchants looking for workers to operate their businesses, estate owners who needed laborers for their vast agricultural lands, and sometimes even gladiatorial schools seeking new fighters for the arena. Some women from Jerusalem were taken to serve in Roman households as domestic servants. They cooked meals, cleaned rooms, washed clothing, tended to children, and attended to the personal needs of their owners. While household servitude was sometimes considered a relatively less harsh form of slavery, it came with its own profound indignities. Servants were the property of their masters, subject to their every command and whim, with no legal rights, no personal autonomy, and no ability to refuse any demand placed upon them. Others were sent to work on farms, in workshops, or in textile factories under difficult and often dangerous labor conditions. These women toiled from dawn until dusk, their bodies worn down by relentless physical work, poor nutrition, and the absence of any hope for freedom. The tragic fate of these captives reflects a harsh and devastating reality of ancient warfare. Victory for one side almost always meant lifelong suffering, enslavement, and dehumanization for the other. The conquered did not simply lose a battle, they lost their homes, their families, their identities, and their humanity. Jerusalem's fall in 70 CE became one of the most famous and heartbreaking examples of this brutal cycle, a cycle in which the powerful crushed the vulnerable, and the defeated paid the price not just with their freedom, but with their very souls. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Jerusalem under Roman rule. Armored soldiers controlled the streets and their authority was absolute. But for many women in the city, their presence meant something far more terrifying than just military power. The screams echoed through the narrow streets of Jerusalem as the city's walls finally collapsed. Smoke rose into the sky in thick, black columns, fire spread from house to house with terrifying speed, and the once sacred city transformed into a battlefield of chaos, fear, and unimaginable suffering. It was the year 70 CE, and the mighty Roman army, under the command of General Titus, had finally conquered Jerusalem after months of brutal, unrelenting siege. The siege itself had been a slow and deliberate act of destruction. For months, the Roman legions had encircled the city, cutting off all supplies of food, water, and hope. Inside the walls, the people of Jerusalem had endured starvation, disease, and despair. Families had watched helplessly as their loved ones weakened and perished. The city that had once thrived as the spiritual heart of the Jewish people had become a prison of suffering long before the final walls crumbled. When the breach finally came, the soldiers of the Roman Empire stormed through the shattered gates with overwhelming and merciless force. Their iron armor clanged in terrifying rhythm as they marched through the ruined streets, and their crimson banners waved high above the destruction, symbols of an empire that demanded absolute submission. The disciplined legions moved through Jerusalem like a flood, pouring into every quarter, every alley, and every courtyard. For the people of Jerusalem, this moment marked the end of hope, the end of resistance, the end of their way of life, and for many, the end of life itself. The city descended into absolute pandemonium. Families ran desperately to hide in basements, behind broken walls, inside the ruins of homes and temples, or in underground tunnels that had been carved beneath the city over centuries. Mothers clutched their children to their chests, elderly men and women stumbled through smoke-filled streets searching for shelter, and young men who had fought bravely on the walls now faced the impossible choice of surrender or death. But there was little escape. Roman soldiers were rigorously trained to search every corner, every home, and every hiding place. They moved systematically through the city, breaking down doors, pulling apart debris, and dragging people from the darkest recesses of their shelters. The efficiency of the Roman military machine left almost no one untouched. The destruction reached its most devastating climax when the soldiers set fire to the Second Temple, the holiest site in all of Judaism. Josephus recorded that Titus himself may have wished to spare the temple, but the fury of the soldiers was beyond any single commander's control. The flames consumed the sacred structure, and the gold that adorned its walls melted and ran between the stones. The sight of the temple burning was, for the Jewish people, not merely a military defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe of the highest order, a wound that would be mourned for millennia. Among the most vulnerable in this catastrophe were the women of the city. As the Roman army took complete control, many women were violently separated from their families. Some were captured during the chaos of the initial attack, seized in the streets as they fled. Others were dragged from homes where they had tried to hide, torn from the arms of their children or their elderly parents. In the fog of war, with discipline often giving way to savagery, women became targets of the conqueror's unchecked brutality. Ancient historians like Flavius Josephus, who personally witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, described the aftermath as one of the darkest moments in the city's long and tumultuous history. Josephus wrote with a mixture of horror and sorrow, documenting how the conquered population was divided among various fates. Thousands were taken as slaves, marched in chains across vast distances to be sold in markets throughout the Roman Empire. Others were sent to arenas to face gladiators or wild beasts for the entertainment of Roman crowds. The young, the strong, and the beautiful were selected for specific purposes, while the old and the weak were often left to perish. The conquest was not only about defeating an enemy or quelling a rebellion. For many soldiers, it was also about claiming victory through domination, plunder, and absolute control over the defeated population. The spoils of war included not only gold, silver, and sacred artifacts, many of which were paraded through the streets of Rome in a grand triumphal procession, but also human beings reduced to property by the cruel logic of ancient warfare. And sadly, women often suffered the most in these moments of war. Their suffering was rarely recorded in detail by ancient historians, who focused instead on battles, politics, and the deeds of great men. But between the lines of every ancient account of conquest and siege, the silent suffering of women endures. A reminder that the true cost of war is measured not only in fallen soldiers and ruined cities, but in the shattered lives of the most vulnerable. Jerusalem fell, the temple burned, and an entire world was lost in the flames.